Good evening, everyone. The major topic that we're going to look at today is anti-Semitism. We're on what is called Unit 8. Last week we did Units 6 and 7 sort of combined. I felt like that was a good idea, but we didn't get to everything in Unit 7. So today we're going to try to go back, do a little bit more on the nation-state law, and then we're going to continue on to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a topic which we're going to stick with for this session and the following session next week. So we'll be able to do anti-Semitism in a couple of different ways. Before we jump back in, the last thing we did last week was we listened to an interview of Mohammed Darwashi, in which, Mohammed Darwashi, who described how he feels as an Arab Israeli with an Israeli identity, but not a Jewish identity, how he feels about the nation-state law. He sort of feels like it's not bad that Israel is the Jewish state, but he also feels like if Israel is the Jewish state, Israel's Israeliness is sort of compromised. Now, that's a very interesting claim to make and is profoundly at odds with everything that I believe about the state of Israel and its character as a Jewish state, right? He came off sounding very good. But then when you think about it a little bit more, you're like, well, what he really wants is an Israeliness that isn't Jewish. And that's very problematic. But it's also very typical of the cultured, cosmopolitan Israeli Arabs. They say, we don't want you to change the character of your state. We just want it to be Israeli, not Jewish. But that is, in fact, changing the character of the state. So I do think that we should to jump in and listen to somebody who helped to craft that law, and then we'll continue the conversation. So let me just share my screen.
The nation-state law, a moral, political, or social necessity, or a moral failure? That's the issue that we're going to discuss today. And joining me is Moshe Koppel. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
So tell me, in your mind, is this law necessary? And if it is, why?
Yes, I think the law is necessary. It's not necessary, as some people have assumed, as a mission statement for the state of Israel. It's not the Declaration of Independence. It's not the preamble to the Constitution. It's not an attempt for Israel to explain to the world what it's all about. It's a law. Laws are technical things. They have technical purposes, and this law serves certain technical purposes, which I'll explain. In Israel, as you know, there's no constitution, but there are basic laws. Okay? So these basic laws are basic in the sense that the courts regard them as being on a higher level of the legal hierarchy than ordinary statutes. So if an ordinary statute conflicts with a basic law, the basic law wins. Now, Israel is a very special country. We are, on the one hand, a Jewish state, or the nation state of the Jewish people, as this law would have it. We're also a liberal democratic country. And obviously, those two values can sometimes conflict with each other.
Like where, for example?
For example, let's talk about Shabbat. Okay. Well, the first question is, and as you know, in Christian countries, the day of rest is Sunday. In Israel, the day of rest is the Jewish day of rest, which is Shabbat. Well, the first thing you might say is, well, wait a minute. There are Christian citizens of Israel. There are Islamic citizens of Israel. The day of rest in Islam is on Friday. In Christianity, it's on Sunday. Why should the Jews be privileged? Why should Shabbat be the official day of rest and not Friday or Sunday? On the other hand, well, it is a Jewish state, so maybe that should be decisive, and Shabbat should be the day of rest. There's tension here. We need to resolve it. more than that. If we're talking about Shabbat, well, what does it mean that it's the day of rest? In what way does the fact that it's the day of rest, in what way is that expressed? The government offices are closed. Should commerce be closed? What exactly is the way that that the day of rest should be expressed in the state of Israel? Now, all of these are questions that need to be debated. They have been debated. Some people prefer for Shabbat to be a day of commerce. People don't have time to shop when they're working. Maybe that should be. Others say, no, we want the public square to reflect the traditional Jewish values of Shabbat as a day in which we refrain from commerce.
So how, like, even using these examples, but maybe they're not for the purpose of this law, how does this law help on those issues?
So for this, a bit of background. Israel, as you know, does not have a constitution. It has basic laws. The basic laws are regarded as superior to ordinary statutes. Ordinary statutes need to be comply with the content of the basic laws. Now, there is a basic law of freedom of commerce. Okay, there's also a basic law of human dignity and freedom. Okay, now the courts have been the challenges have been brought to Israel's Shabbat laws to the courts. The claim being, wait a second, there's a basic law that says that there's freedom of commerce. There's no basic law that says that Shabbat is Israel's day of rest. You may be surprised to hear that there's no basic law. There wasn't until the nation-state law that said that the day of rest in Israel is Shabbat. There's ordinary statutes that said that, right? So the challenge was brought, said, well, this law is in fact in violation, right? Shabbat laws are in violation of freedom of commerce. And back in 2004, 2005, the Supreme Court heard these petitions and ruled that, in fact, these laws are in violation of freedom of commerce. However, because of the particular way that the laws are written and so forth, it's a reasonable and proportional violation which the courts could abide. Okay, but the courts served notice that, in fact, there is a constitutional problem here. It's just one that they could elide or live with.
Now, it's interesting. As I hear you talk, there's very often different people experience Israel very, very differently. And what's the real Israel is obviously very often an issue of Rosh Hashanah. Nobody has what that real Israel is. My sense of Israel is a place where Judaism is very safe and comfortable. That I don't feel that Shabbat and Shabbat observance is being attacked in Israeli society. The government, the courts, even under the basic law of human freedom and dignity, which says that Israel shall be both a Jewish and democratic, the courts have used that Jewish to support the rights of Jewish sensibilities and feelings. And so, what is there a, as you said, very important point you said at the beginning is that maybe a lot of this discourse around this law is overinflated, as if this is the declaration of what the Jewish state is, when for you what this is fundamentally is a law. But is this law, what problem? Do you feel that that Shabbat, the flag, now most law issues don't need a basic law, but let's say that all these issues, I think that these are really under attack, that they needed to be defended. Now, if that is so, then I can understand what you mean. But empirically, again, without getting into, is that your experience of Israel?
Okay, so first of all, I should make clear that my own view about religion and state is that the less the state is involved in religion, the better. I think that religion is not just the principle that religion is a matter of personal conviction and enforcing religion on people is neither good for the state nor for religion itself. Beyond that, as an empirical matter, in countries like the United States, where there's complete separation of religion and state, religion flourishes much more than it does in European countries, where there's less of an
official church,
right? Where there's official churches. There are many countries, and in general, the separation of religion and state is, I think, a good thing for not just for the state, but for religion itself, and not just for those minorities who don't practice the minority religion which might be enforced, but in particular for those who do practice the majority religion. Okay, so I just want to make that perfectly clear. My purpose here is not to get the state involved in the religion business. And in fact, if you look at this law, you'll see that there's very little religion in it
at all.
The law is really about national symbols, and even when it refers to Shabbat, it's referring to Shabbat as kind of a fundamental institution of the Jewish people, not so much with regard to the specific details
of
halachic observance. It's rather about Shabbat as the national day of rest. But with regard to your question, having said all that, with regard to your question, the answer is that if you look at court decisions, starting principally from the era of Aaron Barak in the 80s until now, there's a rather consistent dynamic. In other words, they slowly are choosing liberal universal values over those that express some kind of Jewish national values. This happens with regard to Shabbat. It happens with regard to matters of Jewish settlement. It happens with regard to many areas. So I think that the main thing that this law is trying to achieve is not to say, no, the Jewish character of the state is more important than the democratic character of the state. What it's trying to say is, we understand that the courts have been given only one tool to work with, which is, or two, which is, but from the same direction, which is freedom of commerce and dignity and freedom of man. And as a result, the courts have really had no choice when faced with difficult decisions between matters of Jewish national values and individual liberty and universal values and liberal values. They've really only had one tool to work with, which was the universal side. And the point here was to give them another tool to work with.
So could you give me an example? So let's say Shabbat, I understand the theory. I thank you for articulating, I appreciate it. Very often, for many people, the elephant in the room in this law, and that pertains to what's not mentioned in the law. The fact is that Israel is 20% Arab, Israeli, Palestinian. And in this law, they're not mentioned. And it's caused a tremendous amount of debate, both within those communities and within, that this is somehow an apartheid law, this is a discrimination law. How do you relate to, do you think this law should have established a status and discussed the status of non-Jews in Israel as well? How do you feel about this area of omission?
Okay, so there are several reasons for this omission, and we need to lay them out. The first is that this law is specifically about the Jewish character of the state. There are other laws that are about the democratic character of the state. So the basic law that we already mentioned several times, which is the dignity and freedom of man, that in fact is a law that doesn't distinguish Jewish citizens from non-Jewish citizens, and it makes clear, right, that all of the basic rights, the basic civil and human rights that one expects, are held equally by every citizen of the state. So it's there. It's just not in this law. As I said, this law is not a general mission statement.
And it's not meant to undermine that in your review.
No, on the contrary, this law, as I said, is meant to balance the other law. Israel is a Jewish state. Israel is a democratic liberal state.
But could it have
and we
said
want
Israel
these
is
things
the
to work
homeland?
together.
Could it have said Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people and the state of all of its citizens,
Okay.
including, and it could have said the others. I've heard from many Israeli Arabs,
Right.
You don't see me, you've transparentized me in this law. Maybe some of it has to do with the fact that they see it as a mission statement and not as a law, and therefore that's part of the issue.
Right. Okay. So I understand the argument that says, look, we know there's another law that deals with liberal values, but okay, once you've already said in this law, hey, Israel's it's this nation state of the Jewish people. Well, having said that, wouldn't it have been nice to kind of, say, oh, by the way, yeah, there are other people living here and they have rights too. So I buy that. That makes perfect sense. It would have been perfectly plausible. So now the question is, okay, what should it have said? Okay, and I think there are plenty of things that it could have said. It could have said, for example, that the sovereignty of the state of Israel is held by its citizens, without regard to religion, nationality, or what have you. Right? That would have been a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And as a matter of fact, it was in the previous version of the law. There was a lot of horse trading, towards the end. Well, you got to take this out. Well, if you take this out, then you got to take that out. It got lost in the horse trading, and I'm sorry that it did. But I have to add that it was really necessary to be very careful about exactly what language was put in here in order to say, yes, there are other citizens in the state of Israel and they're not Jewish, and their rights are important to us. For example, one of the things you mentioned is, we could have said, Jewish and democratic state, right? That's kind of become almost a cliche. Why didn't it just say Jewish and democratic state? And the answer to that is that there's a lot of jurisprudence already about that phrase, Jewish and democratic state. And Aaron Barak already wrote in Supreme Court decision that when one interprets the phrase Jewish and democratic, one should interpret democratic as being as broad as possible so that it includes not just procedural democracy, but substantive democracy, in other words, all the liberal values. But when we talk about Jewish, we should interpret it in the most abstract possible way so that it has no meaning at all. And when there's any conflict between the two, or when a judge sees a conflict between the two, well, democratic and liberal should always win. Okay, well, as a result of that jurisprudence, the legislature just said, well, I guess that phrase is not serving the purpose we intended to serve.
So what about the term equal? Given your reading of the current judicial system in Israel, you're much more reticent. You see certain categories as becoming tools that could move Israel in a way that you would be uncomfortable with. I want to ask, as we're coming more to the end, there are two clauses. Let's go into the weeds for a moment, because our audience will have read the law, read background material. Right. There are two, there's both the omission, and you dealt with what's missing and whether that should be or not. But there are two areas here which are often believed to be discriminatory. One pertains to the issue of language. The Declaration of Israel as that the official language of Israel is Hebrew, while recognizing that nothing will impact the status quo on Arabic will not change, but now Israel has officially only one language. That's one. And people say, why not have done it? Since there was no law, why not have done Arabic and Hebrew? And the second one is the specific statement in Clause 7 pertaining to the country sees Jewish settlement as a value. What about Arab settlement? What about their development? What about their needs? If we're citizens, what about us? So these are two areas where the claim of being transparentized and potentially discriminated against are focused on. How do you read both laws? Because it's very clear. You're saying, I'm not for just, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something else. And so how do you read these? Do you think the criticism is fair or not fair? And how do you see this moving forward?
Okay, so let's start with language. In the case of language, I think the criticism is blatantly unfair for a simple reason. There are exactly three paragraphs there about language. The first one says that Hebrew is the national language, which is an empirical fact. The second one says that the status of Arabic is not changed by this law. So it's a little bit hard to credit the arguments that say that Arabic has been downgraded, that it's no longer an official language. If it was an official language before, then it's still an official language now, because the law says explicitly that the status of language is unchanged, of the Arabic language is unchanged. There's also a third paragraph that says that Arabic speakers are guaranteed access to all government services in their language. Okay, now that's as much as you can ask for. I want to remind you that this law, the language part, is not at all about what languages need to be used by individual citizens or by businesses or in the public square or need to be studied in schools. It's not like in Spain, where there's a particular Spanish dialect that everybody has to speak and learn. It's not like in Quebec, where you can't put up signs in English. You can only put up signs in French, and everybody has to study in French. This law is not about that. In fact, the Arabic school system runs mostly in Arabic by their own choice, and nobody has forced them to do otherwise, probably to their detriment, but nobody is forcing them to do otherwise. This law is strictly about how the government conducts its business. That's what official languages are about. That's what a national language is about. How does the government conduct its business? And apart from saying that Hebrew is the national language, which has some symbolic value and is also a fact, the Arabic is getting everything a minority language could ever want, a lot more than Spanish gets in the United States, right? You're guaranteeing access, and its status as an official language remains unchanged.
You feel you want to give the courts, either the courts or the legislature, a protection against certain abuses or potential abuses, and you're very clear in your sense of abuses of an activist court. But the history of Israel also has a tremendous amount of problems in its treatment of our minorities. It's not as if we're dealing here, okay, life's great. Everybody who's a non-Jew in Israel feels that they've won the lottery. You have a 20% who feel seriously challenged. Now, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you be as active? Give the courts the tools. Say, yes, we care about Arab settlements. For example, how many new Arab cities have been started? What about the development of industrial zones? There is clear, even though by law, this country treats its citizens equally, in fact, as we know, that there's very often a very big difference between in theory and what happens. And you said this is a law. And I need this law to fix A, B, C, and D. I need to protect the Jews. Part of the challenge is, what about that other side? And you say, I would have done it differently, and it was hastily done, and it was a mistake, et cetera. But at the end of the day, then, don't you feel that something is then missing? Because Jewish settlement is emphasized. What about the country also cares about Arab settlements? And therefore, now, by doing this law, courts could continue that discrimination. They actually have a lot of quotes. Doesn't that concern you? And wouldn't it be valuable to add some amendments to this law, because that is part of our system? And if it is, and you agree, what type of amendment would you add, if any? And that's separate from defending the law. Now you have a chance to fix it.
Okay, I would not fix the law. Well, let me be clear that even if there are certain paragraphs in this law that I think were not written in the ideal way, I think that just as we have respected the basic law of human dignity and freedom and have not amended it, we have not amended that law, okay?
We did.
There was one amendment which in fact weakened the only amendments
was an amendment.
Slightly weakened it, and not in that one, but in freedom of commerce, not human dignity, but in freedom of commerce, they put in an override. Okay, there was an override clause put in, but there have been countless occasions when problems that have come up could have been solved by making amendments to basic law, human dignity, and freedom. And we didn't, because we have a certain sense of the sacredness of that law. We don't want to mess with it, okay? Because we understand basic laws are very important, and when you start messing with them, you're really getting a little bit too close to the core of the nuclear reactor. You don't want to do that. So I want to give this chance. I want to give this law a chance to become internalized by the courts and
become part of the culture of the country.
Part of the culture of the country.
See how it's used.
Exactly. And then, years down the line, when it has the same status and it's accorded the same respect as human dignity, then we can talk about making amendments. At this point, I wouldn't touch it.
Moshe, thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
Okay, so did you find him convincing?
What was your question? Did we find him
Convincing.
interesting? Yeah.
Did he sway you over to his opinion?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's not what Mishka's repeating.
Mishka, did you find it compelling? Did you find it convincing? Did he sway you?
Not completely. Not completely. When he basically said the basic law shouldn't be messed with, kind of stopped me in my tracks. Not that he wasn't saying otherwise important and reasonable things, but having gone through reading all the stuff about it, it's like, no. I mean, they need a constitution. The basic law is their equivalent of a constitution, and it ain't good enough, at least as far as my thinking is. It's missing a lot, and it has a lot of loopholes. I guess that's the way I think about it. And did he convince me?
Well, we all listened to Muhammad talk about like what it feels to be an Arab Israeli in a Jewish country that he says he has no problem with the Jewish identity of, but then really wants it to be an Israeliness without Jewishness. Okay, but then we listened to this guy, Moshe, who is trying to make a case for why this law is necessary in terms of the jurisprudence of the state itself. Andy, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of this over the week. What does it mean to be a Jew in a Christian country? There's plenty of countries which are Christian. I mean, there's no question, right? So how do they care for non-Christians in those countries? How do Arab countries or Muslim countries care for non-Muslims in those countries? There's only one country in the world that is a Jewish country. And now, to me, the focus of that should be based on Jewish values. Now, as a Jewish state, how do we treat non-Jews in our country is a valid question. And that's a Jewish question in Israel. So but the speaker, I don't think, convinced me in that manner. So
Yeah, right. His point wasn't like protecting the non-Jewish citizens of this country is a Jewish value, and therefore we have to do it well. And here's how this law is doing that while also preserving the Jewishness of the state. because this law doesn't do that while preserving the Jewishness of the state. This law is just about preserving the Jewishness of the state. Now, you and I might have written a slightly different law, right? Okay, Steve.
So my just reaction to what Andy just said is that when you say that the question is, how are we going to treat the non-Jewish citizens of our state, you've implied that it's not their state. So already just phrasing the question in that way creates a position of great second-class citizenness of the Arabs, which is not to say we shouldn't ask the question that way, but we need to acknowledge that it's not coming from a level playing field if we ask it that way. The point that I found, and you know, have been slightly prepared about this, that Capel was alluding, was that his statement that they've already got all the rights they could want because the basic, the human dignity law is not correct. And the reason is because he's failing to distinguish between individual rights and collective rights. It is pretty clear that the human dignity law only protects individual rights. And what the Arab Israeli Palestinians are asking for is some kind of collective right of the Palestinian people within the state of Israel. And there is nothing in the Israeli basic laws and not in the human dignity law that creates any kind of collective right, only individual rights. Whereas what the nation state law is clearly asserting a Jewish collective right in the state that has no balance for Palestinians. If you hold that there's no such thing as collective rights, that there are only individual rights, then this is not a problem for you. But if you do believe in the existence of some kind of group rights or collective rights, then there really is the combination of these two laws is to establish a case where all individuals have individual rights, but only one group has group rights.
Right. Yeah, Sonia.
Can
You
you
have to
explain a little bit for me what you see as a group right?
Steve. So I'll just say, like, the right to see themselves as a like cohesive minority within the state. That is to say, we are the Muslim Arab citizens of Israel, and we want to like have that collective identity.
Or just looking at some of the very basic provisions of the law. How about the right to have a flag for our community? The basic state law says the flag of the country is going to be the Jewish one. And that's a collective, you might say, I would not say, because I generally am in the camp that there's no such thing as collective rights, only individual rights. But if you want to say every group has a right to its own flag, that would be one thing where the basic law is establishing that right for the Jews, but not for the non-Jews.
Right, or at least it's establishing a flag for the one flag for the state, and that flag has Jewish symbols. So which I think is closer to what they would say if they were defending this law than what you said. Sonia, you have to unmute if you want to speak.
Can't seem to unmute it, so it looks like for whatever reason that's not happening. If you can't unmute, maybe log off, log on, back on. But sometimes that works. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Oh yeah, there you go. You're unmuted.
Yay.
Oh, still can't hear you though.
No.
Oh.
Your
Yes.
sound isn't working.
Yes.
No.
Mm-mm.
Not working.
Sonia, it looks like your
Okay.
microphone is not connected.
Yeah, it looks like that's what I think too. All right, Edith, you had your hand up too.
Yeah, when talking collective, the first thing that I was thinking of was settlements. It's only Jewish settlements, not one word, although it was brought up in the discussion between the two men, not one word about Arab settlements. And as they were talking, building up industry in the areas, but definitely the settlements.
I wonder if it's useful to have a comparison. Like, would you expect the United States of America to have a law that supported the establishment and building of Spanish-speaking cities, of Hispanic-only areas of
We
regions
have-
that, right? Like,
We have
I
that
just-
law for Native Americans.
we do for
Yeah.
Native Americans. That is correct. And Native Americans are a special group because in some ways they are completely citizens, and in some ways they are a separate nationality, given like their own separate status. Right, and the Native American law is very, very complicated.
Yeah, and the
My understanding.
Palestinians might argue that, well, we're like them. We were here first, and then the Jews came in and settled the country. I mean, that's
Sure. Yeah, Anita.
Yeah, and last week when we heard Diwali, he complained it took him some time to get to where Hartman was. Apparently they get hassled. They have to show papers or something, I would guess, because he said it took him time. And then he also indicated that his community doesn't have the amenities that Hartman's community has. That things are very much unequal, and I looked at it as many of our Black communities are underserved with sanitation and other kinds of infrastructure. They get the last shake on it, and the wealthier white communities immediately they're the squeaky wheels and get what they need immediately. So so it seems that many Arabs, Israelis think of themselves as second-class citizens, or that the state views them as second-class citizens.
Right. Steve.
So as they were talking about settlements, I thought they were both avoiding the elephant in the room, which is that if we talk about Arab settlements, are we going to somehow limit that to Arab Israeli Palestinians, or is that going to include the 1948 refugees? I think if you opened the door to say we're going to prioritize Arab settlements, very soon somebody would be trying to shove the refugee issue through that door. And I think that's why, I suspect that's the reason why politically there was no interest in introducing any kind of Arab settlement right, because of what that could lead to as far as the 1948 refugee issue.
That's what I was thinking too. That is to say, 1948 refugees like have a very specific special status in the UN, that they can pass on their refugee status to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren in a way that no other refugees in the modern world can do or are allowed to do. And historically that doesn't happen, right? But there's this one group of refugees that is able to pass on this refugee status intergenerationally, and it's this group. And that their right to do that is protected by the United Nations. And when people speak about a right of return, okay, what that means is the Palestinian refugees from 1948 still have their great-grandfather's keys to the home in Haifa that they left in 1948. They want to come back to that house, right? Nobody is, right? So yes, so I do think that like Moshe Capel thinking about the jurisprudence, every phrase of this law is going to be tested in Israeli courts and is going to be used by Israeli courts to defend or certain kinds of cases. I definitely think that putting in language that could open that door would be wouldn't be the intent of the law. Yeah, Boss.
I didn't.
Oh, sorry, Bob.
So the one thing I was wondering about when I listened to it was about, like, when he talks about Shabbat, I was wondering, like, if you want to preserve certain communities where there's no commerce and really where people can allow to celebrate Shabbat the way they want, if you don't put this law in and you vote on it in court, and you don't have this Jewish basis behind the vote, then 20% or 30% of the votes will automatically go against you. And I wonder if they try to protect that this way.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the I'm not 100% sure about that, but my understanding is that the status, so if you went to Israel 40 years ago, like no buses ran on Shabbat, no cars were on the street on Shabbat, like it was very, like there were no stores open, like that was the way it was. And then slowly certain places started running buses, and right, not the public buses, but the private buses. And there were more cars and certain stores were open, and like that happened over the course of time, and it got challenged in court. Like these places are violating Shabbat laws, and the court upheld their right to open.
Yeah.
So now there's a law which the court could use to uphold a community's right to police the opening of certain commerce on Shabbat. And I guess that is a way to protect some of the Jewish character of the state.
Mhm.
There are no cars on the road on Yom Kippur in Jerusalem. And the
The
day
whole of
before Yom
Jerusalem?
Kippur is the biggest bike sales day of the country in the year. And when you are in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur, everybody is just biking everywhere because there are no cars on the street. And so everybody just rides their bikes. Not the people who are, Shomer Yom HaKippurim, like not the people who are observing the holiday, but the like public observance of the holiday is you see a lot of people riding bicycles because there are no cars on the road, 0 cars, but bicycles, it's like so many bicycles. So it's an interesting sort of phenomenon of what is the Jewish character of the state? What does it look like to observe Yom Kippur? Well, might be to wear white, and it might be to ride a bicycle. Sonia, can we hear you now? And Miriam wants to say something.
Yeah, I think that we have to distinguish between the Arabs that live in Israel and the Arabs in the territories. I mean, when you're talking about Arab rights, it's about Israeli Arabs. It's not about the people that live in the territories. They don't have any rights.
Well, they absolutely have rights. But it is true that their rights
But it's
are
different. It's
not the
different.
same as the rights of citizens.
Right.
Yes. This whole conversation about the nation state law is about the 20% of citizens of Israel.
Yeah, but so
are-
why did he talk about settlements? If it's about citizens of Israel, why did he talk about Arab settlements?
Settlement in this case just means like towns.
Okay.
It means like places where Arabs live. So if you go to Israel, right? Say you want to go to Nazareth, right? So Nazareth is an Arab town. Yeah, it's a mostly Christian Arab town, which is very different from most of the Arab towns, which
Well,
are
you have-
majority Muslim. But there's
You
also
have-
a town.
You
So
have
that's
Nazareth elite where
right.
the
I was
Jews
about to
live.
say, right. So Nazareth is a Christian Arab town in the Galilee. Okay, it is in the state of Israel. All of the Christian Arabs who live there are citizens of the state of Israel. And then right next to Nazareth is a Jewish settlement called Nazareth Elite. And the people who live there are predominantly Jewish Israelis. And it's just, elite just means heights. So it's like you have Nazareth and you have Nazareth Heights. Okay. But Nazareth Heights is a Jewish settlement and Nazareth is an Arab settlement. So that's what they mean. Like both of those are settlements in the land of Israel, not in I mean, in the state of Israel, Israel proper, we might say, as opposed to in the territories. Settlement also means like buildings, communities that are being built in the
The West
territories.
Bank.
But in this case,
The
that's
West
not what
Bank,
this is
yeah.
referring to.
Well, at least that's not the way it's being read now, but there are certainly those in Israeli politics who want to understand the nation state law as referring to settlements on the West Bank. And that is another problematic way with this law is being deliberately vague. I
Yeah, I
do
mean, I
wonder,
don't-
because
I
we're
don't
doing this in
disagree with that.
English rather than the original Hebrew, if we're missing some shading of distinctions in these words that would be more distinct in the original Hebrew. But I'm no way to resolve that, but I worry about it a
Well,
little bit.
we do have the Hebrew. Let me just see if I can see what my guess is that it's, you know, that it's a vagueness which is true in both languages. But let me see. So Jewish settlement is the 7. התיישבות היהודית. המדינה רואה בפיתוח התיישבות. Now, that's the same word. So that, I think that's also the word, the yishuvim are the words that you would say to talk about settlements on the West Bank, and hitiyashvut just is the verb of that means settlement. All right, so I'd like to, Gary, one last comment.
I just wanted to add, maybe it's obvious to everyone, but I certainly enjoyed the change in atmosphere on Shabbat when we were staying in Israel, and I would hate to do anything that would remove that. I even sort of liked the fact that they didn't want people working in their offices in the university on Shabbat, and there'd be little trucks, driving around, to remind you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, right. I totally hear that. Like, there is something very special as Jews. There's something very special about visiting a place where the character of the state is Jewish. And I think that that's very powerful. All right, so we're gonna stop here on last week's topic, and we're gonna move on to this week's topic, which is anti-Semitism. So just some words of introduction. Our basic pattern has been to look at the texts and then to talk about them, to watch the lecture and then talk about it. And we're going to skip the looking at the texts piece because I think that the lecture does a really good job of going over the texts. And I really wanted to have the time to talk about Moshe Capel's interview from last week. So we did that instead of looking at the text together. We're going to watch the lecture, and I will pause between the lecture and the discussion to an interview to discuss, and then we're going to go back and watch the interview. But what he does in this lecture is he wants to set up sort of 4 categories of acceptable, 4 categories of how you might relate to difference in a community. And they are pluralism. Pluralism is when you and the other person have different practice, but you both agree that that both practices are equally acceptable. Okay, so you practice one way, I practice another way, right? You might say, okay, you light your Hanukkah candles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I light my Hanukkah candles 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 2 different ways of doing it, but we both agree that we're lighting Hanukkah candles and it's fine. And since the mitzvah of Hanukkah is only lighting 1 candle every night, we both are doing that for sure. So we can say, yep, you're observing Hanukkah, I'm observing Hanukkah, we're both observing Hanukkah. Okay, pluralism. Then there's sort of tolerance. Okay, tolerance is where I don't think that you're right, but I don't think that you're so wrong that you're out of my community. Okay, and the hope is that, you know, we can coexist in community together. Okay, then there's sort of tolerably deviant, which is you are violating the law, but you're doing so in a way which is culturally acceptable. His example of it is driving 85 right above the speed limit. So 75 is tolerance, right? 75 is like the reigning speed of the highway, right? Highway might say that the speed limit is 65, but 75 is the reigning speed of the highway. That's tolerance. It might not be, you know, right? But in fact, if you were driving 65 in a 65 zone, that might be actually dangerous, right? So driving 75, that's the speed of the highway. But driving 85, right? You slip on your wheel a little bit, you cause an accident, right? 85, you're going to get a ticket, right? You might get pulled over to the side of the road. But after you get pulled over to the side of the road, we're not going to take your license away. We're going to let you drive again, right? That's tolerably deviant. We're going to punish you for being out of bounds, but we're going to still let you continue to be a part of society. And then there's intolerably deviant, or like deviance. And deviance is like, okay, driving drunk, right? If you're driving drunk, we're going to take your license away. You're no longer allowed to operate a motor vehicle, right? So we're going to make you leave the community. So he's going to present these 4 categories, and he's going to talk about how anti-Semitism used to be like completely deviant, okay, in the Jewish community. And what we've gotten to in today's world is that different people disagree about whether it's okay to work with anti-Semites, people who have anti-Semitic ideas in other to achieve other goals. It used to be that the whole Jewish community was like, you can't associate with anti-Semites at all. It was deviant to do that. But now some anti-Semites on the left are tolerably deviant, but they're intolerably deviant for the right? Say, I'm willing to work with somebody on climate change who doesn't agree with me on who has said things that are anti-Semitic, but I'm willing to work with them on climate change because climate change is so important that we need to get this stuff done on climate change. And even though I don't agree with them on anti-Semitism, I'm going to still work with them on climate change, right? That position on the left. Person on the right might look at that and say, how dare you interact with that person who is so profoundly anti-Semitic? Whereas people on the right, like, okay, right, maybe he said some things that are anti-Semitic, but he's really pro-Israel and he's really anti-Iran, and I need to work with him on that because because he's making sure that that the world is safer, okay, and even though he said some anti-Semitic things, we're going to work with him. But whereas somebody on the left looks at that and says, right, how can you work with somebody who has said such anti-Semitic things? And both on the left and on the right, we're unwilling to call out our own anti-Semites, but we're very willing to call out the anti-Semites on the other side. And because anti-Semitism has come from this place of a huge red line, everybody's like accusing the other Jews of like completely betraying Judaism. When in fact, what everybody has done is that some anti-Semites have moved into this place of tolerable deviance, but we're unwilling to tolerate the deviance of the other side. So that's his basic point. I think he makes it sort of better than I did. I just tried to summarize it in advance because I think it's a sort of very heady, like a complex argument to be making. And he goes into right specifics. He's like, okay, here's Linda Sarsour, here's Steve Bannon, right? he's sort of equal opportunity attacks on both sides. Okay, so we're gonna look at it, and then we'll discuss. And then I really loved the lecture, the interview, which is about campus and anti-Semitism on campus, and I think that's a really important topic. So we're hopefully also going to get to that. So let me pull this up. And share my screen.
In this session, we will explore the challenges to Jewish peoplehood posed by the current internal Jewish debate around anti-Semitism. If there was anything that over the millennia united Jews, it was anti-Semitism. Today, however, it has become a central dividing line between Jews, between those on the left and those on the right, those in Israel and those in North America. We disagree both on who should be classified as anti-Semitic and how we should respond to them. The goal of this session is to understand the causes and underpinnings of this new reality, as well as explore new ways for thinking about the divide and detoxifying the debate that it has generated. I will then explore these issues in greater depth in an interview with Dr. Michal Biton and Rabbi Yonah Hain. As we experience over and again every day, we Jews deeply disagree about most things Jewish, as well as most issues relating to Israel's policies. Judaism and Israel, more than uniting us, divide us. We disagree on issues of faith, ritual, ethical priorities, intermarriage, politics, how to end the occupation, or whether there's an occupation in the first place, to name but a few. This reality has led most of us to develop a heightened sense of tolerance towards each other in many of the above areas of debate in order to sustain and maintain our sense of and commitment to Jewish peoplehood. As a result, in both North America and Israel, many Jews accept that there are either multiple ways to live a legitimate or meaningful Jewish life, or that everyone ought to have a right to choose to live their Jewish life in accordance with their own religious convictions, even though they may be very different from my own. However, when it comes to politics, this pluralism and tolerance are increasingly rare. Instead of applying categories of pluralism or tolerance, we treat our political adversaries as intolerable, dangerous, and consequently deviant. Let's take a moment to clarify these categories, pluralism, tolerance, and deviance, as they will be extremely important in our understanding of the challenges that are occurring in our discourse around anti-Semitism. Difference in debate, while normative in the Jewish community, are obviously not unique to us, but exist in every community and social structure. As human beings, when we encounter difference, we respond in diverse ways. For some differences, we apply the category of pluralism. Pluralism is for difference which we perceive to be of equal value to our own position. In the Jewish tradition, pluralism is represented by the statement, "These and these are the words of the living God." While we disagree, in certain cases we are able to perceive the other as of equal value and merit, all the while choosing a different option for ourselves. When we apply such an assessment to difference, that is when we are using the category of pluralism. Tolerance, as distinct from pluralism, is an attitude we apply to certain differences that we believe to be wrong and inferior to our own. This gives birth to what is known as the paradox of tolerance. Why tolerate that which you believe to be wrong? There are multiple possible answers. I can tolerate a wrong position because it's not very wrong, or because being overly judgmental all the time is antithetical to the way I believe I and others should and can live with each other. Since difference and disagreement are inevitable, social life requires some level of accommodation towards the other. In its most ideological manifestation, tolerance is applied because we believe that while an individual may be wrong, they have a right, possibly even an inalienable right, in certain areas, to make their own choices and decisions about their lives. While, as we say, your right to swing your fist ends at my nose, as long as I'm not being harmed, you have a right to pursue your own choices, even if and when I find them offensive and even morally wrong. In liberal democracies founded on theories of the inherent rights and liberties of individual citizens, tolerance is the essential foundation of political life and legislation. There are, however, moments when a particular difference is deemed intolerable and classified as deviant and socially unacceptable, principally when it is perceived as harmful and dangerous. When that is the case, social and legal instruments are employed to sanction, shun, and reject the person pursuing the behavior in question. For example, when your fist hits my nose, when I perceive your actions or beliefs as harming me or others, tolerance is simply unacceptable. While I may tolerate adultery between two consenting adults, despite my assessment of its immoral status and even ancillary harm to the spouses and families, societies generally distinguish between behavior conducted between consenting adults and sexual relations where consent is lacking, such as rape and sexual harassment. Behavior is generally assessed as intolerably deviant, either as a result of a desire to protect others from financial, psychological, or bodily harm, to protect society at large, from those who choose to be its enemy from within, and even in certain extreme cases, to protect the individual from themselves, for example, by prohibiting the consumption of dangerous substances. Returning now to our discussion regarding the current state of Jewish discourse, it is understandable why on issues of religion, we find it easier to apply categories of pluralism and tolerance than when discussing North American or Israeli politics. We have a strong sense that human beings are endowed with the right to freedom of religion, as well as a general sensibility that God may be worshipped in multiple legitimate ways. In addition, when it comes to an other's religious faith and practices, other than possibly my own sensibilities, it's difficult to identify anyone who's being harmed. Consequently, pluralism, or at the very least tolerance, seems to be appropriate, if not the required response. This is not the case when moving into the political realm and debating the governing of the public sphere of our society. Alternate political positions put forth very different assessments about the role of government and the policies it ought to take, differences which have a direct impact on the lives of citizens with the potential for immediate and significant harm. When the differences are perceived to be moderate or minor, such as higher or lower taxes, tolerance of the other is relatively easy. This is also the case where there is a sense that we all share similar values while disagreeing about how best to implement them. However, when I perceive my political antagonist to be devoid of any and all moral value, and when partisan differences are perceived to be of critical and life-altering significance, tolerance itself is perceived to be a moral weakness and a failure. In these instances, what seems to be demanded is the application of the category of intolerable deviance and the adopting of a partisan political stance which opposes every step advocated by my antagonist, so long as it is within the boundaries of the law. By using these categories, it's easier to understand some of the more intolerant expressions when it comes to support for or condemnation of Israel, for each side perceives that somebody is being harmed. It may be Israel, liberal Jews, Jewish peoplehood, Palestinians, or America. AIPAC and J Street, not to speak of If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, all represent not merely different positions regarding support for Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Each advocates for policies which others deem harmful and destructive. The lack of tolerance which ensues, while in some cases troubling, is as a result understandable. Let's now turn to the central issue of this session, anti-Semitism. In the midst of this culture of disagreement and debate, we Jews still had one issue that transcended our religious, cultural, geographic, and political divides. There was one thing that united us, and that was the condemnation of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was a collective safety net against internal centrifugal forces resulting from our ideological differences. We always understood that while we may have debated who was a good Jew, our enemies did not. Jews did not debate anti-Semitism, neither who qualified as an anti-Semite, nor what was the appropriate response towards one who was so classified. Anti-Semitism was the danger facing Jews. It posed a clear case of harm, and consequently within the Jewish community, it both warranted and received a universally accepted classification as intolerably deviant. It was the Jewish red line. Being labeled an anti-Semite made one the enemy of every Jew, everywhere. Sanctions, distancing, and shunning constituted the only logical and ethical response. Put simply, Jews did not support anti-Semites, befriend them, or consider them our colleagues or partners. There was no yes, but. Yes, they're an anti-Semite, but really nice people, good neighbors, political allies, etc. Anti-Semitism was a conversation and relationship stopper, including not only the anti-Semite, but the one who was willing to tolerate. The most basic lesson of the Holocaust and the obligation it generated was to create a people united around never again. Never again are we going to stand idly by when someone is harming any Jew anywhere in the world. Fighting anti-Semitism and rejecting anti-Semites were understood to be every Jew's most foundational obligation. Failure to do so constituted the deepest act of betrayal of one's identity, our people, and our history, equivalent to fraternizing with the enemy, if not outright treason. Most importantly, such treason itself constituted an intolerably deviant act, requiring disassociation, shunning, and sanctions. This is why the fracturing that has taken place within the Jewish community around who is to be classified as anti-Semitic is uncharted territory. This is why we're so disoriented by the burgeoning relationships and coalitions between leadership within the Jewish community and figures whom part of our community classify as anti-Semites, such as, for example, Linda Sarsour and the Congresswoman Ilhan Omar on the one side, and Stephen Bannon or European nationalists such as President Orban of Hungary on the other side. If the Jewish left sees the Jewish right as accommodating far-right anti-Semites out of a shared support for certain Israeli policies and sanctions against Iran, their ability to associate with the right, to view them as fellow Jews in good standing, will be significantly undermined. Conversely, if the right sees the far left building coalitions with anti-Semites out of a shared support for the resistance, gender equality, the environment, and other progressive causes, their ability to engage with such Jews will be similarly impaired. Each side in the Jewish divide is embracing the other's intolerable deviant, and in doing so, is infected with the same measure of intolerability. The friend of my enemy needs to be my enemy as well. And it is at that point that our collective identity as a people begins to break down. It is clear that anti-Semitism is no longer functioning as a shared boundary, and that political affinities override anti-Semitic classification. The question is whether this fact means that Jewish peoplehood is no longer a meaningful and socially functioning category. What I'd like to argue is that we need to redefine our discourse, not around anti-Semitism itself, but around our assessment of the implications of these disagreements. Anti-Semitism has simply ceased to be a shared boundary, but not because we no longer agree that it is intolerably deviant, but principally because we disagree over when it applies and the consequences of this application. Let me explain. The shift in the status of anti-Semitism within the Jewish community has been caused by a number of key factors. The first is a blessing of sorts, and that is a sentiment that not every anti-Semite, listen to this, constitutes the most significant danger to the Jewish people. Let me say this again. It is an understanding that not every anti-Semite constitutes the most significant danger to the Jewish people. Using the language of intolerable deviance, their status as intolerable may be suspended. Many Jews feel that there are dangers of greater existential significance that demand our primary attention. These could be a nuclear Iran, Islamic terror, Israel delegitimization, the moral cancer of occupation, or the dangers of right-wing fascism in America, not to speak of universal concerns such as global warming and gender discrimination. Steve Bannon may be an anti-Semite, and the same may be said of President Trump, but they are light anti-Semites who pose a lesser threat compared to Iran and terror. Since there are dangers which are more intolerable, the fact that they are assisting in combating the true existential crises of our era minimizes the intolerability of their anti-Semitism. As a result, it is legitimate to say, in this context, yes, but towards such anti-Semitism, without betraying the Jewish people. Yes, they are anti-Semites, but they support Israel. Yes, they are anti-Semitic, but they are critical in the fight against the nuclear Iran and Islamic terror. And the same might apply to one on the left. Yes, they are anti-Semitic, but they are fighting fascism in America or global warming. In this context, associating with anti-Semites can be even an acceptable policy, if not an act of outright loyalty. It can be viewed as a necessary evil to be accommodated for the sake of achieving victory in overcoming a far graver danger to our people. The second factor, in many ways a blessing as well, is the fact that Jews today have acquired complex identities, in which Jewish peoplehood is but one of many facets of who they are. In the past, when Jews were classified as the ultimate outsiders, Jewishness was the dominant and singular lens through which others perceived us, and through which we perceived ourselves. Today, in both Israel and North America, we have been blessed with the experience of at-homeness, with Israeliness, Americanness, and Canadianness constituting significant aspects of our identities. In addition, the increased importance of one's gender and race identity and political identification complexify our identities even further. We belong to multiple spheres of identity simultaneously and no longer have a singular identity which alone determines our boundaries. The significance of this transformation regarding our red lines in general and anti-Semitism in particular is profound. Someone may be intolerable to my Jewish identity, but tolerable to my American, Israeli, or political identification. The anti-Semite may be intolerable to my Jewishness, but at the same time be one of my key allies in my pursuit of my Israeliness or Americanness. In this context, the whole discourse of boundaries and red lines and the implications of crossing them needs to be reassessed. Now, allying with anti-Semites is not necessarily a betrayal of Jewish peoplehood, but simply an embrace within a certain time and context of an alternate aspect of one's identity and giving to it greater weight. It's not that boundaries have ceased to exist. Each sphere has its red lines, but the implications of crossing them needs to be reassessed in light of the intent. When motivated by loyalty to a counter-identity, I may bemoan the fact that a person's Jewish identity is not central, but they're not intending to betray their Jewishness, but rather reflect the current reality of their identity. For example, Israelis may reject Hungarian President Orban's anti-Semitic stances, but as Israelis, at this time, they feel that it is more pressing that they build alliances for Israel around the world. At this moment, Israeliness trumps Jewishness. When the reality of complex identity is coupled with the first factor, that anti-Semitism is no longer universally considered the most pressing threat, the case for tolerance for the yes-butters increases. Finally, a critical factor impacting our disagreements about who is an anti-Semite is the decline in intelligent political discourse. As is increasingly recognized, while we live in a golden era with unlimited access to information, many of us filter it and use this power to only access sources of information which validate our pre-existing ideas. We rarely expose ourselves to positions which differ from our own, and when we do, we are wired to discount them and classify them as fake news. As a result, in our minds, we rarely find ourselves associating with true anti-Semites. We only associate with supposed anti-Semites, so classified by biased representations and distortions of our political antagonists. When one adds the partisan culture to the issue, we look at who is making the argument more than the argument itself. For example, when attacks on AOC or Linda Sarsour are made by white males, we often automatically disqualify them as yet one more manifestation of bias against women of color and abusive power relationships. The result is that, functionally, most Jews may not experience themselves as having violated the red line of accommodating anti-Semitism. While one side disqualifies the other for its relationships, very rarely do Jews actually believe that they are doing a yes-but move. Their opponents do, but such an assessment is rarely applicable to themselves. The consequence of this is that within the culture of today's political discourse in general, and regarding anti-Semitism in particular, individuals rarely perceive themselves as having crossed any lines. This might be profoundly frustrating to those who believe they are, but again, intent is significant in assessing the consequences for Jewish peoplehood and our ability to tolerate such manifestations. If we internalize this changing reality, we will recognize that regardless of where we personally stand on the political map, the status of anti-Semitism no longer has the same significance as it did in the past. When we have more existential fears, when we have multiple spheres of identity, and when we don't even essentially hear the arguments against our so-called anti-Semitic allies, we have to cease perceiving the debate around this issue with the same level of explosiveness as in the past. Our disagreements have less to do with our internal Jewish divides, and more to do with the larger divides and realities within which Jewish life finds itself. That said, given its historic significance and potential to significantly harm individual and collective Jewish life, there are a number of additional steps which I would suggest we might want to consider. Principally, we need to exercise much greater care and control over whom we classify as anti-Semitic, and reserve it exclusively only for the clearest and most glaring of instances. Much of our disagreements may not be the result of crossing red lines and yes-butisms, but simply the misappropriating of the term. In our current partisan political environment, the term has emerged as an effective and effective political weapon to delegitimize political opponents, and has become an almost reflexive go-to argument. Why go to the trouble of having intelligent debates on policies, of actually listening to the other side, when it is sufficient to label them as anti-Semites, or of Jews as self-hating traitors, both invalidating and silencing them in one fell swoop? There are many diverse grounds on which to critique or reject a person's positions and policies. These should all be exhausted before turning to accusations of purported anti-Semitism or perceived support for anti-Semitism. Controlling the use of the anti-Semitism label must begin with creating a consensus around its meaning. I propose a minimal basic definition for anti-Semitism: the vilification of Jews qua Jews. Under this definition, it is clear that not every far-right position or anti-Israel or anti-Zionist sentiment warrants the classification of anti-Semitism. None of the above positions necessarily entails the vilification of Jews qua Jews. That's not to say that those who espouse them are not anti-Semitic or inexcusable in other ways. It is simply stating that an anti-Semitic classification needs to be proven and not assumed, and that one must be considered innocent of the charge until clearly proven otherwise. As a colleague of mine suggested, when the proofs are too subtle, nuanced, and contestable, it's probably best not to apply the category. As a result, sitting with an anti-Semite on a panel, being in the room with them and not condemning them, printing the opinions of someone who also has anti-Semitic views, and the like, are simply not enough. A case in point is the infamous statement by the US ambassador to Israel that supporters of J Street are worse than Kapos. The ambassador, it should be noted, has recounted that statement, but it remains a useful lesson for the future. Kapos supported the Nazi agenda of attacking, vilifying, and murdering Jews qua Jews. In the unfavorable comparison to Kapos, J Street followers were defined as supporters of anti-Semitic policies as well. One may support or condemn J Street, but the analogy is simply preposterous and must be named as such, regardless of one's political affiliations. To fail to do so divides our community unnecessarily around anti-Semitism and undermines our community's ability to fight real anti-Semitism. I would make a similar argument in the case of President Trump. He has been guilty of dog whistles which have left him legitimately open to accusations of anti-Semitism. Singling out George Soros for the ills of America and leading mob-like racist chants are appalling and a threat to what has made America safe for Jews. One can condemn his actions and his policies, but other policies and statements reflecting a deep friendship with Jews and concern for Jewish issues creates a more complicated picture, which does not pass the minimal certainty test. We must strive to win the debate in the marketplace of ideas and at the ballot. And we must at the same time avoid the facile comfort that comes with categorizing our political adversaries as anti-Semites. In the past, Jewish peoplehood was protected and at times enhanced by anti-Semitism. It created a shared red line around which all Jews rallied. Today, disagreement about anti-Semitism is one of our greatest challenges. While it is no longer a unifying force, it need not have such a negative, bifurcating impact. If we understand the changing context within which anti-Semitism is functioning today, and couple it with greater responsibility and care for its use by all sides of our geographic and partisan divides, we can mitigate its consequences. All that will now be left is for us to provide meaningful and compelling reasons for embracing Jewish peoplehood and seeing it as a source of value in our lives. Thank you. Hi, it's me again. I'm not naive. I know that my statement about President Trump is aggravating and upsetting to some of you. For some, it makes me and this whole lecture intolerably deviant. In preparing this lecture, I considered the option of playing it safe. Why say something that might undermine the ability of people to hear the rest of the lecture? I didn't choose safe because it will not help us as a people. The current partisan divides, while dangerous for America, are catastrophic for the Jewish people. There are real, serious disagreements dividing us, but we need to find ways to hear what the others say and why. Not how I characterize them, but how they understand what it is that they believe. While they are a minority in the North American Jewish community, there are nonetheless a significant number of Jews who believe that President Trump is a great, if not the greatest friend of Israel and the Jewish people. Most Israelis feel the same. In some circles, Ilhan Omar and Linda Sarsour are the greatest anti-Semites in America. And any accommodation or conversation which claims that their anti-Semitic credentials are not indisputable renders the person who doesn't agree themselves an intolerable deviant. Or how could I dare to be accommodating to J Street? Combating this mutual delegitimization is, as you just heard, the whole objective of this lecture. And so I intentionally chose to not play it safe. I chose to offer an argument that attempts to alternately embrace both sides of the partisan divide, knowing that when I do so, I will be alienating somebody. I decided to be an equal opportunity alienator. I know what I'm asking is a difficult challenge, especially when it involves being accommodating towards individuals who you detest. My friends, this is the essence of the challenge of our times. And how you will respond will not determine who is the next president, but will determine the well-being and future of our people. Thank you.
All right. Reactions, reflections, thoughts?
I sort of understand where he's coming from, that there are gray areas. But the question is, if someone makes a, I'll use the term mild anti-Semitic remark, right? They are anti-Semitic at some level, right? And the concern by saying, oh, you're still my friend, implies, yeah, that was an okay comment, and permits them to perhaps take it to a next level. And so I have a concern that accepting mild anti-Semitic comments permits the expansion that, oh, that was an acceptable level, let me find the next, you know, we can take it to an intolerable level very quickly.
Right. Are there other people who agree with Andy that, like, that you feel like in some ways Hartman is advocating for acceptance of mild anti-Semitism as a way of preserving a broader definition of Jewish peoplehood, right? Like, I think from what I heard from what Andy is saying is, okay, like, Hartman is trying to say what's more important than mild anti-Semitic comments on the left or the right is our ability to sit with Jews who are on the left and the right together in the same room and have a conversation together, right? To see Jews on the left and Jews on the right as not two separate peoples, but one people. And the cross accusations of anti-Semitism across the aisle are making it hard for Jews to sit in the same room together. But Andy isn't necessarily convinced that it's worth the risk of escalating anti-Semitism on either side, on the left or the right, just for the positive benefit of having Jews sitting together. Is that fair?
Most of the people who Danielle cited were not Jewish. So there's a difference between, I think, saying Steve Bannon is an anti-Semite or Donald Trump is an anti-Semite or Linda Sarsour is an anti-Semite. People are not Jewish, versus saying J Street is anti-Semitic, because saying J Street anti-Semitic is clearly limiting our ability to get together. But it should be possible for a Jew who thinks Linda Sarsour is an anti-Semite, one who doesn't, should still be able to come together in a Jewish context. It's not clear to me that that's as big a problem as saying J Street is anti-Semitic is a larger problem.
Well, I guess that's true, except like when you if I think that Donald Trump is an anti-Semite and Donald Trump comes to speak to the Jewish Republican Committee, right? And there are members of our community who are members of the Republican Jewish Committee, okay, and they invited Donald Trump to speak, okay, like, or for example, if Linda Sarsour comes to J Street, which she does, so then you're like, it's these groups that are poisoned by association. So I think that's what's going on. I think what's going on is an accusation, not that the good-hearted Jewish people who go to J Street are anti-Semitic, but that they are providing a platform for anti-Semites on the left to have a public voice in this discourse.
I have something to say, but
Yeah, Miriam.
if J Street, let's say, invites Linda Sarsour to talk, isn't it to hear what she has to say rather than agreeing with her?
Yeah, I mean, would that argument also like work for you with respect to, say, an Iranian official like Ahmadinejad or Viktor Orban, right? Like,
No,
is it,
no, it's not the same. It's not the same to me.
right?
I mean,
But
I
is
wouldn't
it
go out of
possible?
my way. I wouldn't go out of my way to listen to Linda Sarsour, but I'm saying if J Street decided to invite them, I guess they want to know what, they want to hear what she has to say. But I think it's not the same as an Iranian official.
Right. I mean, I guess I wonder if it's easier for us to have tolerance for the people whose politics we a little bit more agree with.
Well, I agree with the speaker when he said that we only listen to people that have the same points of view as us, and we don't listen to anybody. We label somebody as, being an anti-Semite or being on the right or whatever, and we don't even want to hear what they have to say. I agree with him. Because as soon as you hear the name, as soon as I hear the name Trump, I say, okay, I don't want to hear it. Or I get angry.
Right. And I think he knows that, right? That was his little disclaimer at the end. He was like, yeah, I know that by saying this, I crossed the line for some of you.
No, he just brings it to me, brought it to my attention, and I am agreeing with him.
Yeah. Gary.
I was mostly holding my head, although but there are a couple of things on my mind. One of them is that this issue of tolerating, I guess what we're calling mild anti-Semitism for the greater good isn't entirely new. I remember it from the 70s in the civil rights movement, for example. And my guess is that it goes back considerably earlier when debates about socialism, when there were debates about socialism. But the other thing, and the thing that I haven't heard mentioned, I don't think, is that one of the consequences of anti-Semitism is that there are Jews whose careers depend on tolerating anti-Semites. I mean, you may not think that may not be the best example of it, but I certainly have colleagues who feel that expressing support for Israel is not a good career move. And my guess is that there are students who feel that it's not a good social move. And I do think that that's an important dynamic right now. And I just haven't heard very much about it from in these programs.
Yeah, the discussion that we're about to hear is, is directly related to anti-Semitism on campus, mostly focused on the student side and less on the professor side. But I have heard that is the case, and it's sort of a practical test case for what is being described in the lecture.
I wasn't, I mean, I mentioned academic careers because that's what I have experience with, but my guess is that there are Jews also who are in jobs where they really need to be tolerant of anti-Semites, or they have a big problem.
Yeah. I will say, right, I'm in a career where it's, there are many rabbis who choose not to speak about certain political issues because of the fear of dividing their community, or of the fear more directly of not being rehired, of losing their jobs, or being censured in some way over stepping into a political morass, right? I feel that when I have felt very strongly that I should say something about a particular issue, I have said it, and I have said it in a way that was able to be heard by most people in the congregation. Did I step on a few toes a couple of times? Absolutely, right? That has happened. But while I occasionally hear from people who say, I really wish you hadn't said that, or I really wish you would have said that a little differently, I mostly hear like, Rabbi, thank you for talking about the difficult issue, right? I appreciated hearing your point of view. But there are a lot of rabbis who just, won't talk about any issue that sort of touches on a partisan divide. And so, right, maybe you weren't talking about rabbis in particular, Gary, but I do think that there are Jews whose professional lives, right, even Jews in the Jewish professional world, who have to like really very seriously consider how to speak about these issues. Yeah, Andy.
No, I mean, along those lines, it's not so much my generation, but my generation before, my parents. Look at how many people changed their Jewish sounding name for business reasons, right? Gavensky was too ethnic, so it became Gavins, right? And there's many examples of that. I don't know why, Gary, when you mentioned this, I thought of when I brought Dr. Eisen up here and drove him into the Schmitz house. He was like, they have an Israeli flag outside. How can they have an Israeli flag outside? Aren't they terrified to have an Israeli flag outside? What's going on? He was shocked by that. So I got that comment. One more comment. And in the lecture, I was also thinking, and I've heard this at times, should we have interfaith meetings? Is there a benefit to that or not? I'm not going to say yes or no, but I have heard many people have concerns with, should we be bothering with interfaith programming? Is there a benefit?
Right. Well, the categories of pluralism, tolerance, and deviance are useful categories for talking about all kinds of inter-community and intra-community dialogue. I used those categories recently in three consecutive sessions of my Tuesday class, which some of you are in, my Parshat Shavua class, and we were talking about sort of using those categories as it relates to the laws of who can give testimony, and sort of thinking about the laws of who is permitted to give testimony in Jewish courts as a test case for these different categories of pluralism, tolerance, and deviance. And I completely agree with you, right, that one way that you could discuss this, and he touched on it very briefly when he talked about different ways to understand God and religion. And it's easier to do that with people who are more different from you in some ways than people who are close to you, right? And so you could definitely use these categories to help think about your relationship to certain other intercommunal and intracommunal disagreements. So I do think that Hartman's sort of framework is a useful framework, even when you take it out of the context of anti-Semitism. Edith.
I've been thinking back about a couple of incidents that we have had in our congregation, including a rabbi who one day spoke on the difficulties that non-Jews had in Israel and the way the towns that they lived in were not equally supported by the government as those of the Jewish communities. I believe starting the next week that the movement began to not have that rabbi's contract renewed. And it was not. There were other things that were involved with it, but that one very definitely was a major consideration on the way that our community thought of this particular rabbi. I also think of a few of our former congregants who found the Israel is always correct feeling amongst a lot of vocal people in the congregation to be very frightening, and it drove them out of our synagogue. They left and never to return. It's kind of that feeling of persecution that those people had has remained with me as something to really watch out for. And how tolerant are we? And I've got to say that you are the first rabbi who has been bringing up the topic and allowing the topic of Zionism to be discussed in a really in-depth manner. And maybe we can start talking to one another again.
So certainly one of my big hopes about teaching this course, right, was to challenge us to be people who are willing to discuss Zionism and our views on Israel, even when we disagree, and especially when we disagree. And I am careful to share my point of view, which I believe is a complex point of view that both criticizes Israel for certain aspects of the actions of the state that I think deserve to be criticized, and also is very strong in defense of the state. And just a few weeks ago I spoke both about the Amnesty International condemnation of Israel, and I gave a vocal defense of Israel against that. But on the same day, I also asked our community to write to the ambassador to make sure that the Kotel agreement would not be backsided because that's an area of like Jewish religious pluralism that I think is really important, and especially important for us as members of the conservative Masorti movement. And I do think that it's important to do both, to be very vocal, both in defense and in critique, in when those are justified and warranted. And I try to do both. And I don't do both always on the same day. It's not like I have to, pat Israel on the back and slap Israel's face in the same moment. Usually I do it in alternate moments. But that day it happened to both coincide. But I do worry that if we are not willing to engage, to discuss, to connect on these issues, that we will lose people and have lost people on both sides. And I want to see our community and all Jewish communities be a place where there is room for disagreement, where we don't have to agree on every issue. So, but this level of intolerance or intolerable deviance that we have created in society isn't just an internal Jewish problem. It is also a problem in the broader secular world. It's a problem in academia. It's a problem in our politics. It's a problem on campus. And it has affected not just our relationship to the state of Israel, but also our relationship to Judaism itself. And that's the topic of the interview, which we're about to embark on. So here we go.
In the last lecture, we dealt with the changing role of anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, how anti-Semitism shifted from being a unifying force, the common and accepted red line for Jews, to being something that is at the heart of our disagreements, something that instead of bringing Jews together is actually undermining Jewish peoplehood. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Michal Biton and Rabbi Yonah Hain. Welcome. Let's start with you, Yonah. So much of the conversation in the official Jewish community focuses on anti-Semitism in campus and the changing face of anti-Semitism in campus. Your life is on campus. Have things changed?
Profoundly so, Danielle. For the first 8 or 9 years that I was at Columbia Barnard, I used to hear people talking about how difficult a place it is for people to be Jewish, and I felt like that was really ignoring the robust Jewish life, all the opportunities to explore your Jewishness and to explore your Zionist identity. But over the last few years, I have seen a shift based on anti-Semitism. And what happens now is there are fewer spaces to be Jewish on campus, or there are fewer neutral spaces for Jewish students.
Neutral mean where they don't feel anti-Semitic, where they don't feel attacked?
I wouldn't say attacked, but where they don't have to address their Jewishness. Let me explain it. It used to always be, if you were getting involved in political conversations, if you were discussing Israel-Palestine, your Jewish or Zionist identity was going to be in the mix. But everywhere else, whether it be the dormitories, fraternity sororities, the classroom, activist circles, student government, your Jewish identity or your Zionist roots were not involved. And slowly but surely, sometimes in the classroom now, it gets more complicated to have a connection with Israel. And what we've seen is anti-Semitism has crept into the conversation, and a student who's running for Columbia College student president, part of the town hall is, what are your Israel-Palestine politics?
Now you shifted, if you notice, I asked about anti-Semitism, and you said, and it's a really interesting point, whereby I could be in a group dealing with global warming or water in Africa, and my Jewish identity and my politics will enter into that space. But if you noticed, you shifted the conversation from anti-Semitism to your positions on Israel-Palestine. Are they the same?
While they're not the same, what's happened is, as fewer and fewer spaces have become neutral for Jewish students, you need to declare, choose, are you Zionist or feminist? Whereas before, it didn't matter. I can just be.
So why is that anti-Semitic?
So what's happened is people on campus with the fierce identity politics and sort of the classification as powerful, vulnerable, oppressor, oppressee, marginalized, or entitled, what's happened is you are placed in one of those two camps. And first, when it came to your Israel politics, that came up. But now what's crept in is your Jewish identity is viewed as a privileged box, as a collective, entitled, empowered group, as oppressor.
Yes, Michal.
Yeah, and I wanted to say what you're saying really resonates. I've seen this on campus as well. And I think there's actually two forces operating at the same time on making Jewish students feeling like they have to represent the fight around Israel-Palestine. One force is internal to college campus dynamics and the way that identity politics are playing out in the progressive world. But I think another force comes from our Jewish community. The way that the Jewish community, an establishment organization, often expects and asks of college students who are just going to school to learn and earn a degree to actually stand up, in a sense, as soldiers for the fight to defend Israel and to kind of have figured out all the answers and how to have strategic positions in these areas.
So actually, by our doing that, we are causing for our students the conflation of their Jewish identity with their Zionist identity.
I think for some students, yes. For other students, we're causing or contributing to them disengaging from the conversation because it's so toxic and so draining, and you don't want to engage in this fight so much that you just step back. And
Or maybe they would be willing to engage in that fight, but they don't want to experience or engage in an anti-Semitic discourse. They don't want to bring their Jewish identity. How do you experience overall in American political life the changing place or the changing discourse regarding anti-Semitism in the Jewish community?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that really come to mind when I think about the shift. One is a tremendous sense of anxiety and feeling disoriented. I think American Jews had this almost like exceptionalist narrative about America being a safe haven, and finally having found this golden Medina that wouldn't have the same anti-Semitic problems that Europe had. And it's almost like a crisis of identity. Like, what do you mean that in America?
Where am I?
Yeah, it's like, yes. What do you mean that in America, this land that was supposed to be not only filled with opportunities, but really be a refuge from anti-Semitism, that we are asking similar questions than populations in other times and other places are asking. So that's the first thing, a lot of anxiety and
And is
disorientation.
that anxiety very deep?
It's very deep psychologically. I think of it as almost a traumatic. It brings up trauma from the past and makes you completely confused about
So it's like
the present.
we have this PTSD. We were PTSD, but we didn't know that it was dormant for a while. And now, just even the smallest thing, we're back in crystal now.
Some of us. I wouldn't.
And I want to
think
ask,
of
is there a
myself.
difference in generations on this issue as in your studies?
I think there's, of course, a generational difference. Although, if we're using the language of trauma and feeling disoriented, I think each generation is feeling that in its own unique way. The second thing that I think characterizes this moment is that there's been new developments in anti-Semitism itself. So one of the ways that I think about it is that we don't have in polite society the sort of racial anti-Semitism that, say, characterized Nazi Germany. Instead, what I see happening is something similar to an older anti-Judaism. What happens when you take one form of Judaism, whether it's a liberal universalist Judaism or an ethno-nationalist Zionist Judaism, and you vilify that Judaism. So that makes it very confusing because someone can vilify one Jew's Judaism while embracing another Jew's Judaism. And that makes it very confusing because it's hard to distinguish who's an anti-Semite. What does anti-Semitism look like? How do we fight it? How do we know who our friends and allies are?
So anti-Semitism is not the vilifying of Jews qua Jews. It's the vilifying of a particular Jew qua Jew, while at the same time, you could have, this is the Jew that I like and this is the Jew that I don't like.
Correct. Although we still have some of the good old racial anti-Semitism, don't worry, we still have it.
And in my experience, I see this playing out in a very stark way because Jewish students who are doing everything they were told to be good, Jewishly identified people show up on campus and they're thrown for a loop because on a college campus, when Richard Spencer, white nationalist, gets up and says, we need to protect white bodies and white culture and white heritage, that is correctly understood as racist, bigoted, discriminatory. By definition, if you want to protect your culture, you're trying to oppress and suppress another culture. But when people of color have a similar sentiment, Black bodies are under attack. We need to upkeep minority heritage. That's celebrated. And Jewish students are coming and saying, yeah, I want to celebrate my Jewishness. I want to protect Jewish bodies. That is being understood on some campuses as being like Richard Spencer, where the intention is, we also want to
celebrate my particularity.
Absolutely. And so the conversation from within the Jewish community is critical as well, but the way it's coming off, the way we are seen, the way we are understood is really difficult nowadays.
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge is that many of the roots of contemporary anti-Semitism come from Europe, where the fault line as to who the other in society was always a religious fault line, right? Just we're a separate religious group. And then what we see here in America is that really the other has often been understood through racial lenses. So Jews who are carrying this narrative of anti-Semitism, focusing them as a religious group, and we're thinking about their religious identity, are actually operating on an American ecosystem when race is perhaps the most significant dividing line between those who are oppressed and those who aren't.
I want to return for a moment to talk more about anti-Semitism on campus, because much of my generation is profoundly worried and sees campuses as the locus of, in many ways, one of the most dangerous focuses of anti-Semitism in North America. Is it as bad as we say, or as we think, or as we fear? I've seen studies which said that the most dangerous campus for Jews in America is your campus, Columbia.
So thankfully, it is not as bad as some of the Jewish media outlets report. But at the same time, as we just discussed, it has gotten worse. So I wouldn't say the sky is falling. it's a golden age to be a Jew on campus, but you're going to encounter some hardship. Now, most students brush it off, ignore it. They're able to live with 2 tabs open at once. There's some complicating factors, but mostly I get to be Jewish as I see fit. I think one of the keys is, and this is in many ways why I'm excited that iEngage is including a session on anti-Semitism, is what we need to do on my campus, and I think the Jewish community in North America in general needs to do, is shifting the conversation around anti-Semitism from weaponizing it and using it as a fundraising tool and using it just as a calling out tool to say, oh, you're out of bounds. We need the Torah of anti-Semitism, right? We've learned from the Hartman Institute that our relationship needs to go from crisis to covenant. Well, now the crisis needs to be covenantal.
What do you mean by that?
Anti-Semitism has reared its head, returned, or
It's there. In other words, you can't. It is there, and it's on campus. Let's just name it. Yes.
And so, what do? Do we run away? Do we roll up our sleeve? Do we ignore it and just join it? Yes, but, or do we roll up our sleeves and say we need to educate what it is that we feel is othering us? How are you erasing us? Why is it that the casual anti-Semitism is acceptable in American society? Oh, Jewish real estate's a hell of a thing. Conversations like that, where people might even partner with you and their friends and you're in coalition and say, oh, well, your organization can afford anything. We need to educate and we need to call it out, but in a way where we don't lose who we are in the process.
Yeah.
I want to stay with campus for one more second. Is the Jewish community at large helping you in achieving this nuance? Is their responses to anti-Semitism on campus conducive in your experience in Hillel?
So I think it's important to realize that college students aren't dumb. University students, they don't need saving. So I'll give you a story from a couple of years ago that deeply impacted my interest in doing this part of the work. A student spent all summer working to lead our Reform High Holiday services. And they had spent the summer with our rabbinic team, and they were working on the chanting and the liturgy and really trying to own it. And by the end of the High Holidays, had felt a greater Jewish accomplishment, a sense of accomplishment than they had ever felt in their lives. And they were on cloud 9 Jewishly. Went home for fall break. Someone in their local temple said, oh, where are you in school? They responded, Columbia Barnard. And the person said, oh, well, that must be horrible to be Jewish there. They were crestfallen. And so in the name of these students who are deeply growing, and their college experience is a time of great Jewish exploration, I think it's important to be careful in how we discuss, how we interact, how we interfere, how we offer help with the college campus.
Yeah.
Michal,
And-
yes, I'm still like.
Yeah, no, I just want to add to something that Yona said, because I was an activist as a grad student at NYU and involved with our labor union. And one of the things that I kept really considering and thinking about is what happens when well-meaning American Jewish leaders and American Jewish organizations assume that all college campuses are the same. And they basically expect each population of Jewish students to behave and become activists in the same way, as opposed to what I think is the best way of doing things. Let's say if there's something happening at Columbia, what I would do then is pick up the phone, call my colleague, my friend, Rabbi Yona Hain, and ask him, what's going on? How can we support you in the way that you need to be supported in your local context and college campus? Because each campus is going to be different, and sometimes even well-intentions might lead to negative results.
I want to shift away from campus now and speak about the partisan political impact on anti-Semitism. And Michal, in the world, in this political environment, as we pick our allies and we divide the world, very often Jews find themselves allies with people who another part of the Jewish community sees as anti-Semitic. How should Jews pick their coalition partners? Is anti-Semitism, should it be a line, or should it not be a line?
Yeah, that's such a difficult question. We are living in such a difficult moment because we're not only facing the physical threat of anti-Semitism, but we're also facing it the way that it's being weaponized in our political world and used in deeply problematic ways.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, you've got politicians and also Jewish leaders from the left and the right, and each of them become really good experts at identifying anti-Semitism when it's across the partisan aisle and at defending and removing any, traces of anti-Semitism when it's there in their political and partisan homes. And that creates just a really challenging reality, and not just for American Jews, but any people of conscience who want to fight anti-Semitism. My advice, or the way that I try to conceive of it, is the following, and I think this relates to something in your lecture, Danielle. I think people of conscience and Jewish leaders need to come up with definitions of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes that are clean of any partisan traces. You need to have a definition of what is anti-Semitic that you can then apply across the aisle. And we need to be honest enough with ourselves to actually have litmus tests and ask myself, does my definition work for people both on the right and on the left? If it does, then I think we can trust ourselves to build coalitions that actually have integrity and that continue prioritizing anti-Semitism as a really significant concern that not only Jews, but anybody who cares about American democracy and generally about human rights need to keep in mind.
Yes, please.
The way I see it is that we talk about red lines. Is this a red line for me? And what's a red line for me may not be a red line for you. But I think we need to introduce the notion of pink lines, because for me, something may be a red line, but for you, you're willing to dabble. You're yes, but. And I think if we have deep pluralistic communities where you have people on the far right, people on the far left. For me, that may be a red line, but we're in Venn diagram conversation with people who are center left and center right and far
So we
right.
should be staying away from pink lines too, you mean?
No, I mean the exact opposite. We shouldn't look at every pink line as a red
As a
line.
red line, I understand.
It's something that I wouldn't do, but the fact that you are seeing it as a pink line, there's no guilt by association. I can be associated, I don't want to be associated with them. But if you're associated with them and we have overlapping values, shared principles and Jewish interests, I think there's a way to create a more holistic Jewish community as opposed to just erecting boundaries and saying, here are the red lines, everyone's either in or out.
Michal, would you be willing to give me an example of where we're doing it wrong? You presented where we should do it right, where we should create a standard which applies to both sides. What's an example, current example, that you believe where we're not doing it right, where we're not being consistent, where anti-Semitism is being weaponized? And it could be, by the way, on the left and on the right.
Yeah, I actually think we should focus on the right because we've spoken so much about the left and college campus, and I don't want to imply that it's only there. I mean, listen, a lot of friends and colleagues that I have in certain parts of the Jewish community are willing to completely ignore problematic anti-Semitic statements by politicians or public figures to support Israel. So as long as you have your Zionist or pro-Israel bona fides, if you then engage in the sort of discourse that talks about Jews and real estate, or just assumes that all Jews are Zionists, or that Netanyahu speaks for all Jews, or all kind of problematic tropes that they would often point out on the left. So when that happens by individuals who support Israel and support Zionism, they tend to kind of give that a pass and say, no, but they support Israel. So because of that, I'm not going to actually insist on calling out their anti-Semitic statements. We can look also, we spoke a lot about college campuses, but the most significant attacks on Jewish bodies in America in the past couple of years have come from white nationalists and from the far right. And we often see some like whistleblowing towards individuals like those who marched in Charlottesville and said, Jews will not replace us. And we have some Jewish leaders who don't call out enough the sort of like allowance or letting that pass because there's a support to Israel implied together with that.
What I would say is, I would love to see a greater recognition of the compromise. If you're in a yes but camp, if you have other interests that allow you to be in coalition with someone who has who swims in the anti-Semitic part of the pool, you have to acknowledge that your hands are dirty. You can't just continue on.
So even if you're
like
doing
business
it,
as
even
usual.
if you're doing it, even if you're doing a yes but, you're saying recognize that you're doing a yes but.
Because that changes things.
And then it changes also the way we could talk. It's not as if instead of it, no, it's not. Yes, I'm doing a yes but, then I don't feel crazy. Then maybe we'll have more consistent definitions. Maybe we won't have as many red lines. Maybe we'll begin. Well, we're going to disagree, and we're going to disagree politically. Anti-Semitism won't necessarily be that which divides us. It might not be that which unites us, but it might not be.
But I think the peoplehood area is exactly where I'd like to see the queasiness, the doubt, the dirty hands play out. What I mean by that is, if you're doing something which is compromising in some way, so don't have the entire truth in your pocket with that decision. Recognize that you still want to be part of a Jewish collective, and your choices politically shouldn't undermine Jewish people.
Jewish people, it requires pink lines, clarity, admitting that you have dirty hands, admitting that you're a human being in essence. Michal, thank you. Yona, thank you very, very much.
Gary.
College campuses all have administrative departments that are supposed to be sensitive to those issues. But neither of those people mentioned it. And it makes me wonder how well, I would like to know how they feel about how well those administrative departments are working.
My experience has been that it's very, very, very challenging, right? Let me tell you about something that happened just this past spring here in Schenectady, right? There's a group in the Schenectady Public Schools that's a faculty group that is involved with issues of making sure that racial justice is a part of the education in the school, and that's like a huge part of the cultural, it's like a faculty for a specific kind of school culture. It's like a group that's really trying to push this kind of an agenda. During the Gaza war, last spring, they published to their group and to some of the rest of the faculty and some of the student body and whatever, chart that they got from Jewish Voices for Peace, right? They got it from a Jewish group that now JVP is not a group that most mainstream Jewish communal organizations consider to be part of the mainstream, but okay, they are a Jewish group, and the group put out this like pamphlet that's basically like, okay, you shouldn't ever use the word two-state solution. You should only use the word apartheid, right? You shouldn't say occupied territories. You should say apartheid territories, right? It was like this whole long list of terms you shouldn't use and terms that you should use instead that call out Israel. And the whole thing it wasn't just anti-Israel, it had a bunch of anti-Semitic stuff, and it had pictures of the land from the river to the sea that had completely erased Israel altogether from it, and it just said Palestine, right? Free Palestine. Okay, one nation from the river to the sea, which is in many Jewish circles, including the ADL, right, tantamount to a call for genocide or racial cleansing of Jewish people from that land. Okay, and it was sent out, and immediately, right, we, the Jewish community, right, me and Matt, Rabbi Cutler, and a few other folks, like, we got involved, and the administration of the school, right, immediately responded to us and retracted. Okay, and I was told, don't you know that you are being used by people who are trying to use anti-Semitism as a way to attack the racial justice work that people of color are doing in the school district? Don't you know that you are letting yourself destroy this faculty culture protecting group in the name of protecting Jewish students against anti-Semitism? You're destroying their possibility of doing this racial justice work, right? So I bring this up because, first of all, I had never really considered it from that angle. And it really made me pause and think. But if you're an administrator, right, and you know the Jewish community is organized and powerful, and the ADL and the Federation, and they're going to call and they're going to keep calling, and right, like, they made that retraction so fast, and they should, right, because what that group put out was completely unacceptable. I'm in favor of them having retracted it, but there were factions in the Jewish community who were like, not only should you retract this, but you also need to censure all of the teachers that were involved in putting this out. And there was a teacher who had put this out who was like a year away from tenure. And there were factions in the Jewish community that wanted that teacher fired because she had put this out there. And this is just in like the Schenectady school district. When you're talking about like a Columbia Barnard or a university campus, I think that it's even more complicated with more factions involved. And I don't envy the administrators trying to decide between, this person who feels like their Jewishness is being trampled by this person who feels like their Palestinianness is being trampled by this person, right? These conflicting identities are so charged and powerful. Anyway, so I would say I doubt that there's any administration that's doing a great job of this.
But that is the job. And that's what their job is.
That's what they say their job is.
I agree. But I mean, that's what the job is.
Yeah.
That's what we say it is.
All right,
Um,
Anita.
I was reminded how close some of the Columbia situation was to us a couple of years ago. Rabbi Miriam Midlarsky, her mother teaches at Columbia Teachers, and she apparently teaches Holocaust, and she was a subject of quite a lot of abuse in 2018. So you know, and then I'm also thinking of the Whoopi Goldberg situation where now we have we're a race again. You know, for a while we actually had become white. It was a long time we didn't realize it that we weren't white. I mean, it came to me a few years ago, you know, that we were white. And I said, well, yeah, but you know, everyone wants to think of us as Jews as a race. Hitler certainly took it back in the same terms as how far back you go with Black ancestry. You know, that was quite a thing. How many back to a 16th to a 64th, and it was the same thing in Hitler Germany, Poland, wherever. If you even if you had converted out, and went back several generations where there were no Jews in your family, you would still end up in a concentration camp. So it's a very, very complicated situation that seems to never go away. I mean, I know I fought as a child when somebody accused me of killing Jesus. My friends came home from Catholic school and I had killed Jesus and I had to fight them.
Yes, as a practical matter, it is, I think, very important for Jewish organizations on campus to stand up and claim we are a marginalized group. We are a group that faces challenges of hate against us. Because if we fail to do that, we lose our standing to complain about it in the future. For all the bad things that are happening in the world, I find that unions people are much more sympathetic today that Jews might be a marginalized group than they were 2 or 3 years ago. And I wish it wasn't coming about this way, but that is one of the things that's happening. Is you used to just get laughed at when you went there and said, "Oh, we're Jews. There's people who hate us. We have this problem." And nowadays, the administrators who would prefer to have their heads in the sand about that are being forced to pull their heads out.
I mean, I think that's right. I think that the profound increase in a violent act of anti-Semitism in this country has reminded everybody, oh yeah, Jews are hated people. Mishka.
A couple of things. One, regarding what just happened at the Schenectady schools, I have to wonder, did they respond so quickly, not because of what was put out being bad, but because they were getting into trouble with the community and responding to that rather than really knowing what was the problem? That was my
right. Well, Matt and I had several meetings with administration, and we did a lot of work on explaining exactly what the problem was. And we also did work talking to our clergy group and explaining exactly what we felt the problem was, at least to some of them who were listening. And I do feel like that was useful. And I did some listening too. I didn't just do explaining, right? I also listened. And when I heard it's possible that anti-Semitism is being used here to crush racial justice, that has been true in the past, that one of the features of anti-Semitism is that it's often hatred of Jews is often used as a way of protecting the people who really have power, or that is to say, the white Christian elites often use Jew hatred as a way of deflecting the masses' negative energy onto something that isn't the actual elite. And that's been true in many different contexts and throughout history. Like, that is one of the features of anti-Semitism. So I did wonder, like, oh, I know this about anti-Semitism, that it can be used this way. Like, is it being used this way in this particular moment? And I don't know, right? I don't know. And it is possible, right? Like, it seemed like there were factions that really wanted this cultural group dismantled because they were inconvenient. They were a thorn in the side of the administration because they're trying to get they're trying to change a culture. And, you know, one step into anti-Semitism, and that gives somebody in power this excuse to shut them down. So I do wonder if that was true, and that's a different way of thinking about it.
Right. The other thing I was really glad came up in the conversation just now was the fact that there really is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And sometimes the one is used as an excuse for another. And if you know, somebody says, well, I'm anti-Israel, but I'm not anti-Jewish. Well, you know, there are a lot of times you hear that, but behind that you hear, I'm really anti-Jewish and I can just use Israel as the focal point, and it doesn't sound so bad as being, quote, anti-Semitic. So
Mishka,
Michal,
I love that you said that, because next week's topic in Unit 9 is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and we're going to really dive into that particular nuance. And I know we've gone over our time, and I'd like to bring us to a close, but feel free to be in touch over the course of the week if you have more comments, and definitely continue to think about these topics. The sources from this week all had to do with this idea of pluralism and deviance and tolerance. So there was the Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim text, and these and these are both the words of the living God. Right. So those are worth going back and looking over because they're good texts, but they weren't specifically about, you know, Israel, and they weren't specifically about anti-Semitism. They were more about this broader set of categories. But please do read for next week the background readings on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, especially the UN resolutions and Natan Sharansky's Test of Anti-Semitism article. Those will be very helpful in our discussion next week. Good night.
good night. Good Shabbos.